Okay, so today's video will be the evidence that supports the theory of evolution. So let's get started. Well, so let's go ahead and start with arguably the most compelling evidence to support evolution, and that's the fossil record, the collection of all known fossils. And most of them, like you see in the picture here, are buried in rock. And to be specific, they're buried in what is called sedimentary rock. You know, here's a fish buried in sedimentary rock. Here's an amphibian. Here are footprints or tracks left behind in sedimentary rock. Well, this is exactly what it looks like. Here's fossilized feces that were uncovered in sedimentary rock. Well, despite most fossils being found in sedimentary rock, you know, there are some that are found in other means. You know, for instance, here's an insect that was trapped in tree sap, and the tree sap hardened it into what we call amber. You know, there have been fossils that have been found frozen within ice, really well preserved until, you know, we come along and discover them. But most found in sedimentary rock. So let's talk about that next. Well, so let's talk about sedimentary rock. You know, over time, wind and rain will carry dirt and soil, and this is called sediment. And over time, the dirt and soil begins to accumulate into a layer that will eventually harden into what's called sedimentary rock. Well, this process repeats over and over and over. More wind and rain will carry dirt and soil, and another layer, here we have a third layer of sedimentary rock forming, and over time this will harden. And again, as time passes, the process continues. More dirt and soil accumulates, more sediment accumulates, and eventually hardens into sedimentary rock. And so, you know, let me add a fifth layer just for fun, and let me add a sixth layer here just for fun. I hope you get the idea. But here we have various layers of sedimentary rock. Do rock layers actually look like this? Yes. Here you see a picture taken. You can actually see the various levels and layers of the sedimentary rock. And within these rock layers could be fossils that were buried, you know, millions of years ago, waiting to be uncovered. And so we can determine the relative age of a fossil of a fossil or a rock layer based on its depth, how deep it's buried, what rock layer it's buried within. So let me ask you, which of these 6 rock layers do you think is the oldest? Well, based on what we talked about, how sedimentary rock forms, I hope you would say the oldest is the lowest layer. Therefore, the top layer is the youngest. And this is really supported by the law of superposition. New rock layers form on top of older rock layers. And if I add some fossils here, let's pretend that these animals died and their dead remains were buried and eventually uncovered by people. Well, if I were to ask you which of these fossils is the oldest, well, because the trilobite is buried in the lowest layer of sedimentary rock, it would be the oldest as well. If I reset the picture and ask you why aren't dinosaur fossils found in the deepest rock layers, you can see the dinosaur fossil found in the 3rd layer from the top. Well, the reason you don't see any dinosaur fossils in the 3 lower levels is probably dinosaurs did not exist at the time when the 3 lower levels were forming. And how about this? What does it mean if trilobite fossils no longer appear in the upper rock layers? Well, eventually life may go extinct. And if you have the trilobite fossils found in layer 1, 2, and 3, and all of a sudden they no longer appear, they're probably extinct, and that's why there's none left to leave behind a fossil. And so, when we examine the fossil record, we can come to a few conclusions. If we, here we have again some trilobite fossils in one of the lower levels, a little higher maybe fish fossils, a little higher maybe dinosaur fossils, a little higher let's say the fossils of large mammals. This pattern demonstrates nicely one of the conclusions, and that's newer fossils tend to be more complex. We don't find large mammal fossils deep, deep, deep within the layers of the earth where we would find trilobite fossils. So that's simply because large mammals didn't exist. Large mammals don't appear in the fossil record until really the extinction of the dinosaurs. Another conclusion that we can come from is seen nicely in this picture here. We can compare the relationships between modern organisms, such as modern-day horses, to the fossilized remains of horses that we found long ago. And what we've seen is over the past 40 or 50 million years or so, horses have gradually become larger in size. No coincidence. This is also around the time when the dinosaurs went extinct that mammals began to grow and evolve into larger organisms that we see today. But we can compare fossils from ages ago to those horses that are still alive today to see that life really has a common ancestry, a connection in its evolutionary past. Let's take a moment to talk about how we can determine the absolute age of a fossil through what's called radiometric dating. We can determine the relative age of a fossil based on the layer of sedimentary rock that a fossil might be found in. But radiometric dating allows us to determine a more accurate or an absolute age of a fossil, and it uses isotopes, atoms of the same element with differing neutrons. Probably the best known examples of this would be carbon-12 and carbon-14. If you've ever heard of carbon dating, well, this is an example of radiometric dating. First of all, let's look at the carbon on the top here. It has atomic number of 6, which means 6 protons. It has the atomic mass of 12, which means 6 protons plus how many neutrons adds up to 12? Well, that would be 6. So carbon-12 has a combination of 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Look at the carbon on the bottom. It has the atomic number of 6, which means 6 protons. Well, its mass is 14, so 6 protons plus how many neutrons adds up to 14? Well, that would be 8. And so carbon-14 has 6 protons, but 8 neutrons, and you can see that's the definition of an isotope. Atoms of the same element, they're both carbon, but they have a different number of neutrons. Well, what's my point? Where am I going with this? Well, when organisms are alive, organisms are breathing in gases from the atmosphere, organisms are drinking, organisms are eating, and when we take in molecules through breathing, through drinking, through eating, we are taking in carbon-12 and also carbon-14. So when an organism is alive, it's constantly taking these two atoms in, these two isotopes in. But when an organism dies, its carbon-14 begins to break down or decay. And so carbon-14 has what we call a half-life of 5,730 years. Well, what this means, the half-life, the definition is the number of years it takes for half of the isotope to decay. So for example, after 5,730 years, half or 50% of the carbon-14 that was in an organism when it died will be gone. It will have decayed. And we'll go over an example of this in a moment. But what we can do is we can use the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 to help determine the absolute age of a fossil. Let's go over a couple examples of this. Here we have our 3 fossils again, and let's pretend the atmosphere of Earth naturally has 40,000 parts per million of carbon-14. Well, just as a reminder, the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years. Let's pretend that the fish fossil is discovered and analyzed, and it contains 20,000 parts per million of carbon-14. Notice how 20,000 is half of 40,000. when the fish was alive, it likely would have had 40,000 parts per million because it was taken in molecules from the environment. But now it only has 20,000 parts per million. That means one half-life of time has passed and it's lost 50% of its carbon-14. We would determine this fish fossil to be about 5,730 years old. But look at the insect. Let's pretend the insect contains 10,000 parts per million of carbon-14. Well, 10,000 is half of 20,000, and 20,000 is half of 40,000. So 2 half-lives of time has passed since this insect was alive. So 2 times 5,730 years would be 11,460 years. That is what we would determine this insect fossil to be. Look at the trilobite on the bottom. Let's pretend it has 5,000 parts per million of carbon-14. Well, 5,000 is half of 10,000, and 10,000 is half of 20,000, and 20,000 is half of 40,000. So 3 half-lives of time has passed. So 3 times 5,730 will give you the absolute age of the trilobite, 17,190 years old. So that's a good example of how we use isotopes to determine the absolute age of various fossils. And when we use radiometric dating and other methods of dating rocks and fossils, we can come up with numbers such as the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Prokaryotes or bacteria are 3.5 billion years old. Fish, the first vertebrates on Earth, about 510 million years old. Here's the date for amphibians, reptiles, mammals and dinosaurs, birds and flowering plants, and humans about 200,000 years old. Well, you know, these numbers are accurate. However, there's a problem. Can anyone really relate to these ages? You know, the average human may live 70, 80 years at best. So it's really, really hard for a human to grasp what it means to be 510 million years old. So here's a neat little trick that I'm going to go through here. Okay, so what we're going to do here in this little scale here, we're going to condense the 4.5 billion years that Earth has existed into a single 24-hour day, because that's something that we all can relate to. So on the far left would be Earth's formation, on the far right would be present day. At this scale, 1 minute is equivalent to 3 million years. Well, let's get started on this. So when we start to add some information, well, here's a picture of what are called stromatolites, and these are rock formations created by bacteria. And stromatolites are the oldest evidence of life on Earth, and they date back to about 3.5 billion years old. On our timeline, that puts us around 4:30 in the morning. Well, the next thing I want to add is the first vertebrates, fish, the first animals with a backbone. Fossil evidence indicates that they evolved around 510 million years ago. That puts us after 9 p.m. at night. Now, I also want to mention that fish are interesting not just because they're the first vertebrates, but hey, humans are vertebrates, so we have an ancestor long ago with fish. Well, the next one I want to mention are amphibians. Amphibians are interesting because they were the first vertebrates that could walk on land. Yes, they use the water to reproduce, but they're able to, they're hybrids. They're able to go between the land and water. And fossils put them on Earth about 340 million years ago, right around 10 p.m. on our 24-hour timeline. Well, the next I want to mention are the reptiles. What's unique about the reptiles is they were the first vertebrates to live exclusively on land. Fossils indicate that they evolved around 310 million years ago. That puts them around about 10:30 p.m. at night. The next I want to mention are the mammals and the dinosaurs. And mammals are interesting, of course, because humans are mammals. So the evolution of mammals eventually leads to humans. Well, mammals and dinosaurs, evidence shows they both evolved around the same time, about 250 million years ago. On our scale here, that puts them around about 10:45 at night. The next I want to include here would be flowering plants and birds. It kind of makes sense that they evolve around the same time because, again, birds often pollinate flowers. Well, this was about 175 million years ago. On our 24-hour timeline, that puts them just after 11 p.m. Well, let's add this. Let's add Homo sapiens, us, humans. Fossils indicate that humans evolved around 150, 200,000 years ago. Look at our scale. 1 minute is equivalent to 3 million years. We're not even a minute old on this scale. In fact, we're about 3 or 4 seconds old on this timeline. And when you look at the pattern, there's a really obvious conclusion. Life began very simple, but has become gradually more complex over the years. Well, so let's talk about fossils a little more. There are what are called transitional fossils, fossils that link two different types of life. Here's a great example of one. For a long time, scientists have thought that reptiles eventually evolved into birds. Well, if that's true, shouldn't there be some fossils out there that are part reptile and part bird, some transitional fossils? And this picture shows a transitional fossil called Archeopteryz, an organism that shares both bird and reptile characteristics. Well, in the fossil picture, you can see some of its reptile features. You can see the bony tail. Upon closer examination, it has teeth. Well, what about the bird features? Well, it has wings and it has feathers and it has a wishbone. And so here we have a good example of a fossil with characteristics of two different types of organisms, birds and reptiles. For a long time, scientists have believed that some kind of land mammal eventually led to the evolution of whales. Well, if that's true, shouldn't there be something out there, some fossils out there that's part land mammal and part whale? And here's a great example of that. Basilosaurus. It shares both whale and land mammal features. Well, the land features would be the fact that it has teeth more similar to a wolf, and it has hind limbs, actual leg bones. But when it comes to the whale features, the ears are the bones of a whale and has a long spine like a whale, and we find these fossils in dried up ocean beds, so we know it was an aquatic organism. Another example, for a long time scientists have believed that fish eventually evolved into amphibians. Well, if that's true, shouldn't there be something out there that's part fish and part amphibian? Well, here's a great example called Tiktaalik. It's the fossil remains of an organism that's part fish and part amphibian. Well, what's so fish about it is you can see the scales on its back and it has fins. But what's so amphibian about it is that it has eyes on the top of its head, like an amphibian, and it has little wrists, like an amphibian. And so when you examine these transitional fossils, it really nicely demonstrates that, for instance, birds and reptiles have a common ancestor. So these are great specimens here that show that life has evolved over the years.
Well, the next topic I want to mention are what are called vestigial structures. These are organs or body parts which have lost most or all of their original function, or their function is greatly reduced from what it once was. There's all kinds of non-human examples. For instance, the eyes of blind cavefish. For instance, the wings of flightless birds like emus and ostriches. Or the leg spurs of snakes like this boa constrictor. These are vestigial remnants of the fact that their ancestors probably had legs in the past. Well, let's focus on human examples of vestigial structures. Let's first talk about, as in human embryo, the human embryo has gill slits, or pharyngeal arches as they're called. Now, they're vestigial. They don't help the embryo breathe like gills would help a fish breathe. But the fact that human embryos have gills is a pretty clear indication of our fish ancestors, hundreds of millions of years ago. Another good example is your tailbone. At the bottom of this picture here, you see the purple small piece at the bottom labeled the coccyx. Well, that's the scientific name for the tailbone. Now for humans, it's vestigial. It doesn't help us for balance, but for other organisms it does. You've probably been to zoos and you've seen monkeys using their tail for balance or to wrap around a tree branch, but for humans it's vestigial. Another good example is the appendix. And the true function of the appendix, we really don't know in humans. There's some evidence that perhaps it will harbor good bacteria to help in the digestion of our food, but nonetheless vestigial because its original function in humans is lost. In other organisms that have a functional appendix, it helps them to digest plants, and that's not its function in humans. Another example would be the third molar that some humans eventually grow when they get older, the wisdom teeth. For other organisms, this helps them grind plants down. Again, for humans, it's vestigial. Heck, some people, we don't even have room in our jaws anymore. Our jaws have gotten smaller over the years. We don't even have room in our jaw for many people to even have a wisdom tooth come in, without all kinds of pain and problems where they actually have to have the tooth pulled by a dentist. Another good example is the third eyelid, also called the nictitating membrane. In humans, it's vestigial, but in other organisms, it keeps dust and dirt out. It's that pink in the corner of our eye. Here's a great example of in another animal, it helps to keep dust and dirt out. Now, here's a bird. Now watch as the picture changes. You can see a third eyelid beginning to come over the eye. And now you can see how this eye has like a translucent cover to it. The third eyelid in other animals is often translucent and transparent, so the organism can see through it, yet still keep dirt and dust out. Again, this is vestigial in humans, but the fact that we have a remnant of it is a link to our past. And so again, we have all kinds of evidence to indicate that we have ancestral life in our long ago past.
So the next topic I want to talk about are homologous structures. And these are body parts with a remarkably similar structure despite them performing a different function. You look at these animals right here. They all live in different environments. The whales have adapted to life in the oceans. Birds have adapted to flight and flying through the air, for example. And these four animals here are examples of tetrapods. Tetrapods are animals that have 1, 2, 3, 4 limbs to them. Humans, 2 arms, 2 legs. And if we compare the forelimb, now the word forelimb just means like the front limb. For humans, it's our arms. In dogs, it's the front legs. In birds, it's their wings. And in whales, it's their front flippers. When we zoom on in and compare the bone structure and the muscles and the ligaments and the tendons, we see a remarkable similarity. Yes, the shape of the bones, the size of the bones are slightly altered because it helps the organism in their environment. But the fact that these structures here are so remarkably similar to one another indicates that probably some time ago in the long ago past, they had a common ancestor. So the next topic I want to talk about comes from the development of embryos. Very different species actually show a very remarkably similar pattern of development. Here's an early embryo drawing of a fish, of a salamander, a tortoise, a chicken, a pig, a cow, a rabbit, and a human. Note that in their early stage of development, they are virtually indistinguishable from one another. Now, as time goes by, the different body plans of a tortoise becomes more noticeable, of a pig becomes more noticeable. And here we have a later snapshot in their development. And then here we have, much later in their development. And now you can really see the difference between tortoises and pigs. But the fact that organisms follow a very remarkable pattern of similarity in how they develop, again, is a pretty nice indication that at one time in our evolutionary past, we had a common ancestor. Some of the more compelling evidence of evolution comes from biochemistry, DNA, RNA, proteins, chromosomes. For example, this piece of DNA through transcription is used to make RNA. And then through translation, a bunch of amino acids are gathered and assembled into a protein. Well, this is true of all life. This is not just for humans, not just for mammals, not just for animals, but all life here on Earth. And so here we have the genetic code for life on Earth. Again, not just humans, not just mammals, not just animals, but all life on Earth build their proteins in a remarkably similar way, again indicating that life probably had a common origin, a common ancestor, billions of years ago. Well, we also know that the more related species are, the more similar their DNA and RNA, their proteins, the more similar their biochemistry. Here we have an elderly couple here. Well, when they were younger, let's pretend they had these two daughters. And the daughter on the left married this man, and the daughter on the right married this man. And the daughter on the left over the years had two children, and the daughter on the right had one child. Well, what if the daughter here asks the question, who do I have more DNA in common with, my male brother or my female cousin? Well, her dad says, well, the answer is you and your brother. You and your brother because you and he have more recent common ancestors. Only one generation has passed since her and her brother had a common ancestor. But with regard to the cousins, you and your cousins have a more distant common ancestor, your grandparents. So the farther back in time you go, the less you have in common with your DNA and your genetics and your biochemistry. So let's relate that to humans and chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans. We've compared our DNA to that of a chimp. It turns out it's about 1.2% different. Compare that to a gorilla. Humans and gorillas about 1.6% different. In humans and chimps, about 3.1% difference in our biochemistry. This shows us that we have a closer relationship with, for instance, the chimpanzees. We have a further ago relationship with the orangutans. So here we have a pathway leading to humans, and using the numbers from just a moment ago, since we have less in common with orangutans, we know that they branched off earlier than, say, gorillas, because we have more in common with gorillas than orangutans. And therefore, we even have more in common with a chimp. Notice how chimps and humans are really side by side in this diagram because we have more DNA in common. It wasn't as long ago that we had an ancestor with chimps. Well, you know what I want to do right now? I want to look at a protein and compare it. Here is a protein called cytochrome C, and this protein is made from a bunch of individual amino acids. In fact, cytochrome C is made from 105 amino acids. The AA in the circle means amino acids. And what we've done is we've actually compared human cytochrome C to that of fruit flies and bullfrogs and so on. And it turns out that human and fruit fly differ in 24 of the 105 amino acids. But humans and bullfrogs, we differ in 20 of those 105. Humans and pigeons, we differ in 12 of the 105. Humans versus cows, we differ in 10 out of the 105 amino acids. Humans and rabbits, we differ in 9 of the 105 amino acids. Humans and a rhesus monkey, we only differ in 1 of the 105 amino acids. And as far as chimpanzees go, when we compare our cytochrome C to theirs, they're identical. So here's some really good information here that really shows nicely how closely we are related to chimpanzees. Now, this is only one protein of course, thousands of different proteins, but in this one example, it nicely demonstrates how remarkably similar we are to chimpanzees. And so what this again shows us is that we probably had a very recent ancestor with chimpanzees sometime in our evolutionary past. But it also shows us that we had an ancestor with fruit flies as well. Again, 24 differences, but 105 possibilities. So again, that's 81 similarities between our cytochrome C and fruit flies. We actually have a lot in common with fruit flies, but because time has passed, a lot of time has passed, we've built up these 24 differences. And so biochemistry has been some of the most compelling evidence to indicate that life has changed and evolved over the years and to show that life had a common ancestor. Okay, so as we wrap up, if you're in my biology class, try these review questions here, and I'm happy to check your answers either before school one day or after school. So thanks for watching, everyone.